Good evening, everybody, and welcome back. Today I have with me Dr. Amran Mayer. He's a gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and distinguished research professor in the Department of Medicine, Psychology, and Psychiatry at the David Geffen School of Medicine at the UCLA. He's the executive director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience at UCLA and co-creator of the CURE Digestive Disease Research Center. He's one of the pioneers and leading researchers in the role of mind-brain-body interactions in health and chronic disease. His best-selling book, The Mind-Gut Connection, has remained the #1 bestseller until now, and his new book, The Gut-Immune Connection, will be published in June 2021. Dr. Mayer, such a pleasure having you here with me. How are you today?
Thanks, Talia, for having me on the show. It's a real, it's really exciting for me to talk to you about this important topic, and hopefully this will contribute to an education of your patients as well, and helpful to your patients as well.
Thank you so much. Yes. So the first question I wanted to ask you, you have studied the microbiomes and the connection to the brain and the connection to the nervous system. Can you explain how does it apply to multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, it's not immediately obvious why there would be a connection of the gut and the microbes that live in the gut with something as devastating as multiple sclerosis, affecting multiple aspects of the nervous system. But let me just say a couple of things about after which this will make a lot more sense. So I've been interested, as you mentioned, in the interactions of the gut with the brain and the mind for most of my career, and the last 7 years or so, with the advent of microbiome science, I've gotten really interested in how the microbes, the 100 trillion of microbes that live in our gut, how they relate to this concept of the brain-gut interactions. And from this latest phase of my interest in research, this concept of brain-gut microbiome system or axis has sort of become almost a household word, surprisingly. Now, why would this be of importance to an autoimmune disease like multiple sclerosis? So most importantly, the gut is not just the organ that we thought like 20 years ago is primary function is digestion and absorption and storage and elimination of waste materials. It's a very unique system that has, I would say, 3 major components. One is the immune system. It has about 70% of all the immune cells in the body are in the gastrointestinal tract, between the layers of the gut. The gut is also the biggest endocrine or hormonal system in the body that produces hormones that are sent throughout the body, reaching all sites, including the brain. It also has its own nervous system. So the gut has this, what's called the little brain of the gut, or the enteric nervous system, that essentially can regulate gut function without input from the big brain. So the gut has its own computer that runs peristalsis and secretion and contractions. So all these systems are compartmentalized in the gut, and this is the amazing part of it. They're microns away from 100 trillion microbes. So cells that live in the darkness, they're invisible. They live in the darkness and the oxygen-free environment of our large intestine. And they're so close to the immune system and the endocrine system and the gut's nervous system, and also the sensors that come from the big brain, that it's almost a miracle that they're not overwhelmed the whole, this whole regulation. But the microbes are separated very tightly from these other systems by a mucus layer that lines the gut, and by a very tight barrier of gut cells that form, like a very tight barrier. And as long as this barrier is intact, everything works perfectly and in harmony. If the microbes get more access to, let's say, the immune cells in the gut, and there are some immune cells that have these little tentacles that stick out into the mucus layer, called dendritic cells. If there's an abnormal contact between the microbes and these immune cells, then immune cells report that as a warning sign. It activates other immune cells in the gut layer, and you get this low-grade inflammation at the gut level. And that inflammation can actually then expand and travel throughout the body through various mediators called cytokines, also through components of the microbial surface, so-called lipopolysaccharides. They can travel throughout the body. They can get to your, well, first of all, locally, they can get to the little brain of the gut and change its function. But they also can make it all the way up to the brain and get through the blood-brain barrier, and activate immune cells that are in the brain and in other parts of the nervous system, which then produce cytokines, inflammation. So then you can have the systemic low-grade immune activation. So this is not like what we call sepsis after an infection, which is a life-threatening, full-blown activation of the immune system. It's a low-grade activation, and over time, that will affect the nerve cells. It will lead to inflammation of the nerve cells, so-called neuroinflammation, and also degeneration. And then the secondary reactions of the nervous system to that damage. So this is, in very general terms, the layout of this complex system that we understand now. And this immune system component whereby the microbes inappropriately activate the immune system has become sort of a major concept that's being applied to many diseases, from Alzheimer's disease, cognitive decline, depression, autism spectrum. And obviously all these diseases have their unique pathophysiology, including MS. They're very different neurological damage and dysfunctions, and but the mechanism providing this chronic inflammatory input seems to be something that's fairly common. Now, why do we have that today? If you look at this, the epidemiology of MS, as well as many other diseases, pretty much all our chronic so-called non-communicable diseases have that same pattern, that in the last 75 years, there has been an increase, not just in industrialized countries, but also now in developing countries. And we've also seen an onset in younger patient populations in all these diseases, from obesity to colon cancer, depression. And there's also been in MS sort of a shift, which if males and females are affected differentially, so there's been an increase in women, somehow pointing towards some role of the hormonal system as well. But all these point towards that something happened around the world in the last 75 years, sort of after World War II, that has changed the basic interactions of the microbes with the rest of our bodies, including the immune system. And that concept has also recently been applied to MS. What role does this low-grade immune activation play, both in this increased prevalence in younger individuals. And so a big thing of this is what has changed. I mean, many things have changed in the last 75 years, but one of the top factors is clearly the change in our diet, a dramatic change in our diet, with the dramatic increase in industrialized agriculture. So the way that we, produce our food, have limited the variety of foods, and have dramatically increased consumption of animal products, which used to be too expensive. They've become cheap based on this mass production. And so I've been looking at this for other diseases, including cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease, and it is very striking how dramatic the food system has changed, how the diet has changed, and how that has really affected everybody around the world. We used to, so this development unfortunately started in the U.S. with after World War II with modern agriculture, but in the meantime it's spread all over the world with exports of some of the products, and so I would say, from a bird's eye perspective, I would say that these dietary changes and lifestyle changes, they come obviously with other things as well, with chemicals and pesticides and environmental toxins, new viruses. So it's not diet alone, but it's a key part, I think, in this process. And when we think about potentially what opportunities are there for treatments, diet is kind of a low-hanging fruit. It's not something that we have to develop something completely new. But I think, it's a good idea to go back and test in controlled clinical trials and studies, if you switch patients at high risk to for example, a largely plant-based diet, doesn't have to be vegan or vegetarian. Does that have an impact on the recurrence rate? Does this have an impact on the severity? And so I think studies like this are ongoing in many fields of medicine now, including MS. And so I would say, as an introduction, this sort of gives a good overview. So I'm not claiming, that you can treat MS with dietary changes, but I think we have to sort of focus on this idea. What can we do today? And there's definitely going to be still a long time before we have new molecular disease-modifying agents without side effects. But what can we do in the meantime to really affect this current trend?
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of the more common diets for MS are actually largely, most of them, actually not all of them, are largely plant-based, and the results are pretty incredible. I actually myself changed to became vegan after my diagnosis, and I feel amazing. I don't even remember most days I have MS. So I can completely relate to a lot of what you said. And the gut and its microbiomes have only recently received attention as a possible mechanism in MS. So I wanted to ask you, how did this change in focus came about?
Well, I would say there's really two things that have happened. One is, and this was an earlier phase, people have proposed possible explanations or theories why there has been this increase, actually fairly dramatic increase, in a variety of autoimmune diseases. So as a gastroenterologist, I deal with inflammatory bowel diseases, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease. And there has been the same trend. There's been an increase in Western countries, but also a dramatic increase in developing countries like Brazil. There has been this observation, the onset in children, same pattern. And just the same thing has happened with allergies, many food allergies that were unheard of when I went to medical school, like peanut allergies all of a sudden appeared. Asthma has increased dramatically. So the earliest explanation was this something called the hygiene hypothesis, that as part of this industrialization, accelerated industrialization, last 75 years, that there has been a progressively decreasing exposure of our immune system to relatively benign microorganisms and to stimuli that the immune system could have used to train itself to differentiate between potentially harmful and lethal infections and things that are not that may lead to a chronic settling of a microorganism. H. pylori, for example, in the stomach is one of these examples that have been listed that people have had for thousands of years. And there's some evidence that has protected us, having some of these parasites and organisms, that has taught our nervous system early on during development, the first few years in life, to really differentiate between stimuli from the body, antigens from the body, such as nerve cells or cell membranes, and external things that are harmful for us. And so this hygiene hypothesis, there's clearly a lot of support for that. and you could, I recently talked to somebody who was kind of concerned about it. We'll be going through now in the current pandemic that this hygiene has even gotten more extreme. So now we're also separated from, for those of us who are wearing masks, face masks, we're separating ourselves from any microbes that are floating around in the environment, benign microbes, and we don't touch people anymore, and we constantly disinfect our hands when we come from outside. So this is the kind of trend that has been going on for some time in the developing world. If you compare this, I was at a conference a couple of years ago in Malaysia, and you go through the food markets and see this, seemingly horrendous dismissal of any hygiene. People that prepare the food, they touched their pets before, and the soil and everything. So this is definitely something that also plays a role, that the training of our immune system early on in life. Now, this training also involves during the same phase is the development of our gut microbiome. So this training is really teach our immune system what's good and bad, but also to tolerate all these good microbes that are in our gut and not attack those. So we go in the early part of our lives through a very important training period, and many things have changed in this training period, including this excessive hygiene. And then also with medicine, that we got rid of all the parasites that kids have typically in many parts of the world. I mentioned this H. pylori, and there's another term for this. So the old friends hypothesis, that we as humans have lived with certain microbes, not the gut microbiome, other microbes that have the potential to be dangerous to us, but they've decided to live with us in harmony, and it's almost like commensals. They don't do anything to us, but they have helped to train our immune system early on. So we've gotten rid of those as well. So if you compare this, with the school system of children, we've removed a lot of very important elements to train our children from the curriculum. And certainly now what we're faced with, with two things. We have a compromised training early on in life, and then we have this onslaught by an unhealthy diet, which creates this low-grade immune system activation and inflammation throughout the body. Two components that I'm sure play a significant role in MS. I mean, there's no question, as they do in all the other autoimmune diseases. There's growing evidence, and that's kind of a fascinating aspect to me that in Western medicine we're so trained to specialize on our disease and a particular cell type, and so now what we're seeing, there's all these commonalities between these diseases and the co-occurrences, and I think that's what's happening with the autoimmune diseases as well, that we see these commonalities. Our genes haven't really changed in the last 10,000, 15,000 years. It takes about that long for them to change. So with these increasing prevalences in different parts of the world, it's got to be the environment, it's got to be factors. And as I said, a common denominator of all these factors affects the competence of our immune system, of being overreactive in terms of allergies or autoimmune systems, and being chronically overactive in in all the metabolic diseases, metabolic syndrome and obesity, and so I don't know, if there is an increase in MS susceptibility with obesity. I don't know if there's any link between that at all, but so it's definitely what we're going through right now in terms of it affects the autoimmune diseases, allergies, and a large number of metabolic diseases, all of which are basically created a healthcare crisis of epidemic proportions, really, that we so far have not developed medications to cure it or to prevent it. We have a growing number of medications that can suppress the immune system with a lot of side effects, but we really have not able to develop preventive measures, that go without side effects.
Yeah, and we know that there are heavy ones when it comes to medication for MS, so can't wait for the day for that to be created. So is there a specific alteration in the gut microbiome of patients with MS that you know to share with us?
Yeah, this is again similar to many other of these chronic diseases or these these gut microbiome related diseases. If you study a population with patients with MS, both the relapsing form or the chronic progressive form, you will see alterations in the composition, the relative abundance of individual microbes. But we don't know if this is a causal relationship. We don't know if these abnormal microbes that are seen play a causative role in causing MS. So from what I told you about this, the hygiene hypothesis and the old friends hypothesis, it's quite possible that the damage, happened really, or the wrong programming happened early on. And what we see today in an adult patient may no longer be a causative factor. It still may provide the inflammatory response that we talked about, but it may not be the causative factor that was important early on. And yeah, so there are differences, and these differences go along with with that concept that I mentioned. Some studies, and the studies are conflicting, so not every study shows the same findings. Some show a decreased diversity and richness of the microbes, which is always an indication for a compromised function of this ecosystem of resilience, which we generally think about the microbiome, that it's an incredible resilient system that allows changes in diet and perturbations without really causing any harmful effects on the body. But only some studies show that. Some studies do show the same changes that we see in with the other diseases I mentioned, so a decrease in the beneficial microbial taxa. And when we say beneficial, so they're the ones that play a role in the production of molecules that have an anti-inflammatory effect. So like the short chain fatty acids of butyrate, which are microbes make out of plant-based food, out of fiber. There's a decrease of those that play a role in the regulation of the mucus layer that, as we talked about, insulates or isolates the immune system from the microbes inside of the gut lumen. Yeah, so similar changes that we see in other diseases that are associated with the typical Western diet. And it is kind of interesting, how, and I mean, I've sort of analyzed this and gone back to this when I wrote my second book, the gut-immune connection. So our ancestors for a long time, had a largely plant-based diet, and when they developed ways of processing food and cooking food and fermenting food, they were able to make that even more efficient. There were phases in evolution where meat consumption became a big component, and but it is interesting that that plant-based food provides. It's almost like our microbiome is kind of really functions optimally in response to plant-based components of the food. There's another element or group of molecules called phytonutrients in plant-based food. They're called polyphenols, or sometimes mislabeled antioxidants. So they prevent or slow damage of nerve cells. At least when you add these molecules to cell cultures, there's thousands of these molecules in plants. The highest concentrations are in berries, in dark berries like blueberries and blackberries. And so they provide also the color for many of these plant and fruit items. And they're very large molecules. So when you eat them with, in a plant-based diet, they're not absorbed in our small intestine, just like the fiber. They go down into the large intestine where the microbes are required in order to break them down into smaller molecules. Then these smaller molecules are absorbed and they go into our systemic circulation. We don't know exactly what the benefits of these thousands of these molecules are. It's kind of a new field in science and medicine. And but there's no question in my mind that they play an important role in preserving and repairing damage to the nervous system. So when somebody eats a plant-based diet and feels better, I would say the two most plausible explanations are you eat more of these fiber molecules that translate into anti-inflammatory molecules and a better insulation of your immune system from the microbes in the gut. And the second one, you feed your body a lot of those these polyphenol molecules that have a beneficial effect, protective effect on the nervous system, on cells in the nervous system.
So you did mention your new book that is about to come out, the gut-immune connection. What are your biggest findings? Would you share with us?
Well, the biggest findings, some of them I've shared with you already. That the science now provides us. I mean, I'm surprised there's still a debate between people that stick to or swear to the benefits of a certain diet and completely oppose the other camp, it's scientifically not justifiable. It's no longer, because the evidence is so overwhelming for these benefits or these components of a plant-based diet that that it's really hard to argue. And there's epidemiological studies of tens of thousands of individuals on a Western diet and like Mediterranean diet, and you see that the ones on the Mediterranean diet are healthier, don't have fewer cases of diseases, variety of from depression to inflammatory bowel disease to actually don't know if in some of these studies, I did not run into this. These big epidemiological studies, they also found that there's a markedly reduced prevalence of multiple sclerosis and other autoimmune diseases. I would not be surprised at all. So that's one thing. Another thing is that our health is closely linked to the health of the plants, and which means the plants grow in the soil, obviously, and therefore the health of the soil. So the soil, most of your listeners probably won't know that the soil has its own microbiome, and the interactions of the soil microbiome with the roots of the plants is actually very homologous to the interactions of our gut microbes with our lining of the gut and our gut's immune system. So many of these health beneficial molecules, these polyphenols I mentioned to you, that when we eat them in form of plants, are produced by the plants in collaboration with the soil microbes. So the soil microbes stimulate the plant to increase the production of these molecules, which are then also the pharmacy for the plant. So the reason plants, organically grown plants in a soil rich of soil microbes, can produce molecules to protect them against pests and against drought, and keeps them healthy without chemical fertilizers and without chemical pesticides and insecticides. And so that it's a pretty amazing insight that we basically piggyback on what the plants have developed for our own health. And then I sort of take this even one point further, that if you look at this, what happened with industrial agriculture in the last 75 years, what it's done not just to the quality of the food that we eat, and but also the destruction of natural habitats, including the soil, and also like rainforests in order to make room for meat production. You notice that our current health crisis is directly related to this environmental crisis, which is, I just find it amazing how we're in the midst of multiple. So we're in the midst of the pandemic right now. The pandemic will go away with a vaccine, but there's no vaccine for our epidemic of other crises that are all interconnected and which are moving forward. Many people warn of this progressive worsening of climate change, but our health crisis is equally threatening. We just contain it by throwing enormous amounts of money at new medications, but we don't really deal with the root cause of that problem. So this is the main message I try to get across to readers. Don't look at just your personal health in a selfish fashion, but try to understand this as a societal and as a much larger problem that we're dealing with. And there's a growing awareness, particularly amongst younger people, that we have been living in a way in interactions with the world around us, which affects us directly then through the food and affects our health, that is just not sustainable. If you think about, we live in a world where you have these increasing rates of all these diseases, all these chronic diseases like MS. It's devastating for affected patients. We come up with expensive medications, making our healthcare system the most expensive in the world. Certainly not the most effective one for the majority of patients. And we do little about the root causes. We let it just continue to go on. Only if there's a catastrophic situation, then people for a short time become aware of it, and politicians talk about it, but then it sort of goes into the background again. So that's, that is in some ways my big worry. I would understand, if you're affected by MS, particularly with a progressive form, it's so devastating for your quality of life and every aspect, that you might ask yourself, why should I be concerned about, at this point, about all these other aspects of health? But certainly if you're in full remission and you realize the connections and what needs to be done in all aspects of our society, and you can start as an individual, as a patient, with choices of food and selection of food, then I think it's an important insight. And I think this necessary revolutionary change or paradigm shift has to change with has to start with a much greater awareness and understanding of the big picture.
So if the food we consume has such a big role in creating those diseases, then we can understand that, of course, it can play a big role in, getting into remission or recovering. I want to talk about the time. If you find anything about the length of recovery in your researches, and I'm asking it specifically because I know that a lot of people, let's say somebody's listening to us right now and they understand there is value in shifting their diet. Oftentimes people say, let me try for a short amount of time immediately. If they don't see, immediate results, they say, oh, it doesn't work, and go back. So I want to hear if you have some, proofs to this.
Well, I don't have proofs, but I think we know a few things. So first of all, the microbiome is a lot more adaptable than our immune system or our gut. So the microbiome can adapt to a different diet within a week. Like when you switched from a Western diet, I assume you were eating before, to becoming a vegan. If I'd measured your gut microbiome before and 2 weeks after you started a new diet, it would be different. It would have adapted. There would be new organisms an increase in organisms that break down, the fiber molecules and the polyphenols, and you would have a much healthier looking microbiome. It would take a while before the other systems in your gut, so the immune system and the nervous system and the endocrine system, would change. They certainly can't change as dramatically. They're programmed early on in life, as we talked about the immune system, and there's certainly a certain mismatch between how rapidly your microbiome can adapt to new situations, as opposed to how rapidly the rest of the body can adapt. So I would say you can induce measurable changes fairly quickly, but also the microbiome can readapt as quickly as it changed in the other direction. So when you stop your vegan diet, you'll be back exactly to the point within a short period of time that you weren't before. So it's not like if you pursue your vegan diet for, let's say, 10 years, and the studies are not, not available today to really look exactly at these time courses. Did this lead to more permanent changes in the way your whole gut system with its different components functions? But I would say from what we know today, you will have you will have to really change your lifestyle and make permanent changes. I always say it's about diet in general, not just for patients with MS, but if you really want to do something for your health by changing your diet or other aspects of your lifestyle, then it has to become permanent. It's our bodily systems are not really. Once we go over the first 3 years of life where everything is adaptable and our bodily systems are fairly stable, so you can't just turn them on and off, if you change your diet back and forth. One thing, talking about lifestyle, so, we talked a lot about diet, but there was clearly a few other things. So this brain-gut microbiome axis, also because it has the brain in it, responds to signals from the brain. Many of these negative changes in the microbiome and the immune activation in the gut, and the increased permeability, the low-grade immune activation, can also be induced by influences that come from the brain via the autonomic nervous system. So a lot of negative emotions like fear, anxiety, chronic stress, particularly when they're chronic, activate the sympathetic nervous system, which many studies that have shown this can do very similar changes in the gut system and in the immune system as a bad diet can. So now if you put the two together, many people living in the modern world, are consumed or affected by negative emotions. Some act them out politically, and I think we are seeing phenomenon like this at the moment. But a lot of them are not even consciously aware of this, and they send them down to their gut, to the immune system, and affect its overall health of the system. So I would say it's definitely something very important to keep in mind for patients. And I know it's much harder if you have a disease like MS. Your brain is always system in the brain called the salient system that's constantly monitoring what will happen in the next minute and what will happen, or making projections and what's going to happen in the next year. If you have a chronic disease, a relapsing disease, clearly the system is programmed to anticipate potentially something really bad could happen, a recurrence. Then there's social isolation for some people, severely affected. So there's a lot of reasons that can affect the brain and then the emotional system in a negative way. I've met some patients who have shown remarkable resilience in terms of their mind and their the positive spirit that they've been able to maintain, and which has probably protected them from a more rapid progression of disease. But I think it's really important. The concept of a brain-gut microbiome interaction implies that factors from the brain and the environment, factors from the gut interact, and then from the brain also sleep is another one of those factors that plays a big role in controlling or decreasing the inflammation at the brain level, the immune system activation. So the perfect storm would be poor sleep, chronically angry or worried, and an unhealthy diet. That clearly, and that's not an uncommon phenomenon in the Western world. So I think working on all three aspects is definitely something of significant importance.
Absolutely. So a complete lifestyle shift, like we're learning from so many sources at this point.
Yeah. So the time of these fat diets that you go on a diet for like a keto diet for a month and lose 20 pounds, and then regain it when you go back on your regular diet. I mean, that I think that phenomenon is still extremely popular, in advertisements, but it's not good for your health. Neither starving your microbes with a diet full of fat and animal products, nor when you stop that diet and you bounce back and you have this yo-yo effect and you overshoot your weight from the beginning. That's nothing to do with health. I think your patients, I'm sure they're not concerned, about the cosmetic aspects of dieting. It's a totally different story when you talk about your health, and lifestyle. I think we know enough today about healthy lifestyle. There's many studies, hundreds of thousands of patients where they identified 5 lifestyle factors that made a huge difference in the health and well-being and healthy aging in people that pursue them. And they're very simple things like, mild to moderate exercise, a healthy diet. Non-smoking is another thing, but a positive mindset. So I think the data is overwhelming. We're just in the process of throwing our most advanced scientific analysis techniques at understanding why those simple factors have such a big impact. And I think it would ultimately create a very different type of medicine. We're not going to let people get sick and then throw the most expensive and toxic medications at them, but we'll try to prevent them from getting there in the first place by changing their lifestyle. Ideally, early on in life. I think it should really start in elementary school or kindergarten.
Yeah, I highly agree. And I think, I'm seeing a movement of starting to bring, mindfulness and more of raising consciousness into really younger ages. So I do believe that over time, this will happen and we will see this in the world. And hopefully the sooner the better, of course. But I love that I see different programs coming to, elementary schools and it's starting. So that's at least some movement.
Yeah, I think we're in the beginning of a paradigm shift, which is driven at multiple levels. It's driven by science. It's driven. I think I'm sort of optimistic. We had sort of a setback for a while now, but what we see is, the ascendancy of women to many leading positions in politics around the world, which is an amazing phenomenon, which I think in some ways will accelerate this process. Women are much more concerned about the health of their offspring than men. And that hopefully will really change policies. Public policies play a big role in this because our current system of lobbying of the big food companies and pharmaceutical industry, the medical industrial complex, and the agricultural industry play a huge role in why we are where we are and have made more progress and are watching seemingly helplessly this increase in all these diseases. So a big hope is, with women influencing these decisions much more in the future. Also corporate leadership, I've seen that as well. That some, like for example, I've interacted with a company called Patagonia. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Many people wear their products, and so their CEO has been a woman until recently, thinking exactly along the lines that we've been talking about. That you need to change the general attitude and approach towards many aspects of society if you want to affect a healthier world. And I think we will see this more and more. I'm optimistic. Maybe, the fact that we've gone in the opposite direction for 4 years will help to accelerate this process now. That people have seen this was, this can be done very differently and in a much better way. So.
Absolutely. I definitely want to see it happening in the world as soon as possible. Dr. Mayer, thank you so much for joining me today and for caring so much about the MS community. I'm personally looking forward to June to get your new book. And I'm sure our guests too. So again, thank you so much for your time and hope to do it again sometime.
It was great talking to you, Talia. I really enjoyed it. While your listeners are waiting for the book, they can also go to my website, emranmayer.com, and sign up for the newsletter. We are planning to cover the topic of MS and the brain-gut microbiome interactions in some of our future editions, certainly inspired by the contact that we have had and the conversations that we have had. And so thanks again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah, and I almost forgot, Dr. Mayer shared with all of our listeners of Healing MS a free chapter from his previous book, The Mind-Gut Connection. So this will be in the comments of this interview, and you're all going to have free access to that. So thank you for that as well, Dr. Mayer.
You're welcome.